The women whispered that the Acharu wasn't casting shade, it was sheltering the village from a judgment it had earned. But Gabriel only saw an obstacle to God's work. The story opens during a season of stagnation. While the villagers gather beneath the massive tree, drinking, trading, praying in its shadow, Gabriel arrives from the city with a Bible in one hand and certainty in the other. He is a man of faith and progress, viewing superstition as chains and the elders' reverence as cowardice dressed up as tradition. The air hangs heavy with palm wine and unspoken resentment, foreshadowing the rupture to come. The Acharu had stood in the center of Umosi for longer than anyone could remember. Its trunk was so wide that 10 men linking hands could barely circle it, its roots breaking through the packed earth of the village square like the fingers of something buried trying to claw free. The canopy spread so vast that it cast shade over the market stalls, the church building, and the cluster of benches where the men gathered each afternoon with their calabashes of palm wine. Everything in Umosi happened beneath that tree. Marriages were announced there. Disputes were settled there. On Sundays, Pastor Elijah preached from a wooden pulpit positioned between two roads, and on Mondays, the same spot became a drinking den where the unemployed men argued politics and laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. The women hated it. Not the tree itself, but what it had become, a monument to wasted time, a shrine to the village's refusal to move forward. While their husbands sat in its shade debating imaginary solutions to real problems, the women walked 3 kilometers to fetch water. While their sons lounged against its back waiting for opportunities that would never come, the women farmed cassava in soil that yielded less each year. Amora was one of those women. She sowed roasted corn at the base of the tree, close enough to hear the men's laughter but far enough to avoid their breath. She watched them every day, these grown men with nothing to do and nowhere to be, and she wondered when Umosi had decided to stop trying. The tree itself seemed indifferent to their struggles. It simply stood, ancient and immovable, its leaves rustling secrets in a language the village had forgotten how to speak. It happened on a Tuesday, during the dry season when the sky turned white with heat and even the chickens moved slowly. Amora was turning corn over her coal pot when she noticed something strange. The base of the tree was wet. Not damp. Wet. Water poured in the grooves of the bark, trickling down in thin rivulets that caught the sunlight. She stood, her heart suddenly loud in her chest, and touched the moisture with her fingers. It was cool, impossibly cool, and when she brought it to her lips, it tasted like nothing, pure, clean, without the metallic tang of well water or the algae bitterness of the stream. "The tree is crying," she whispered. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. The men stumbled over from their benches, squinting at the phenomenon with drunken confusion. The women came closer, their faces tight with wonder and fear. Becky, the tailor's daughter, had been limping for 3 years, a bad fall from a mango tree that had left her hip twisted and painful. She approached the tree now, leaning heavily on her walking stick, and without thinking, knelt to press her hands against the wet bark. The water seemed to pulse beneath her palms. She gasped. And then, slowly, she stood. No stick. No limp. Just a girl standing straight for the first time since childhood, tears streaming down her face. The crowd erupted. Some fell to their knees. Others backed away, making signs against evil. The men returned to their benches, muttering about tricks and coincidence, but their voices shook. Amora stared at the tree, at the water that was already drying in the heat, and felt something shift in her chest. The tree had spoken. The question was, who would listen? The miracle faded like morning mist. Within a week, the men had explained it away as groundwater, a broken pipe, mass hysteria. Becky walked without a limp, but so what? Maybe it had never been that bad to begin with. The tree returned to being just a tree, and Umosi returned to being just a village going nowhere slowly. But Amara couldn't forget. She watched the men more carefully now, really watched them. Chief Okonkwo, who once owned 3 farms and now owned 3 excuses. Boba turned, whose sons had gone to the city 10 years ago and never sent money back. Young Ibrahim, barely 20, already developing the belly and dead eyes of a man who had given up before he'd even begun. They gathered under the tree every single day. Morning, afternoon, evening. An unbroken chain of wasted hours. They debated government corruption as if they themselves weren't corrupt with laziness. They complained about lack of opportunities while opportunity rotted in the fields because no one wanted to plant. The women, meanwhile, kept the village alive through sheer stubbornness. They farmed, they traded, they walked to distant markets to sell vegetables for coins that disappeared into their husbands' calabashes. They raised children who would inevitably become either another generation of shade dwellers or another wave of youth fleeing to cities that chewed them up and spat them back broken. Umosi was dying. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like a plant whose roots had been severed. And no one seemed to notice except the women, whose backs bent a little more each year under the weight of keeping everyone else upright. Maybe that's why, when Pastor Gabriel arrived with his message of destruction and renewal, it was the women who listened first. They had been waiting for someone to name the rot they'd been smelling for years. Sometimes the truth needs a voice. And sometimes, that voice comes from the last person you'd expect. Gabriel stepped out of the bus on a Saturday morning, carrying a single bag and a Bible so worn the cover had split at the spine. He was Umosi's son, born under the Acharu's shade, baptized in its shadow, but the city had changed him. His clothes were pressed, his shoes unscuffed, his eyes sharp with the kind of purpose that made people uncomfortable. He went straight to the church. Pastor Elijah greeted him with cautious warmth. Gabriel had left as a troubled youth and returned as an ordained minister with credentials from a seminary no one in Umosi had heard of. They sat in the small office behind the sanctuary, and Gabriel spoke for 2 hours about his vision. The tree is a spiritual anchor, he said, his voice low and urgent. It's holding this village underwater. You can't see it because you're too close, but I've been away. I've seen what Umosi could be, and I've seen what it's become. The difference is that tree. Pastor Elijah frowned. It's just a tree, my son. No. Gabriel's fist came down on the desk. It's an abandoned shrine. Your grandfather's grandfather made covenants beneath that tree, promises to gods they've forgotten. The tree was never just for shade. It was an altar. And when the village stopped honoring it, the blessings turned to curses. That's superstition. Is it? Gabriel leaned forward. Then explain why every young person who succeeds has to leave. Explain why the farms yield less every year. Explain why the men can't even bring themselves to work anymore. The tree isn't giving shade, it's casting a shadow over this village's destiny. Pastor Elijah wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Because deep down, in the place where faith and fear touch, he knew Gabriel was right. Something was wrong in Umosi. Something had been wrong for a very long time. What do you want to do? He asked quietly. Gabriel smiled. I want to wake them up. Gabriel organized the first prayer program for the following Sunday evening. He set up speakers, printed flyers, invited neighboring villages. The theme was breaking spiritual strongholds, and everyone knew what stronghold he meant. The tree stood silent as the villagers gathered, some curious, some skeptical, some actively hostile. The men remained on their benches, watching with crossed arms and narrowed eyes. The women came closer, drawn by hope or desperation or simply the novelty of something different happening. Gabriel began to preach. His voice carried across the square, passionate and certain. He spoke of stagnation and destiny, of ancestral mistakes and modern deliverance. He pointed at the tree, called it by name Acharu, the ancient one, the forgotten shrine, and declared that its time had ended. This village will never move forward, he shouted, until we cut down the thing that's holding us back. The response was immediate and divided. The women began to clap and shout, Amen. The men began to jeer and curse. The argument was building toward violence when the first drop fell. Just one, fat and heavy, landing on Gabriel's Bible with an audible splash. Then another. And another. Within seconds, rain was pouring from a sky that had been cloudless moments before. But the rain fell only in the church area, only on the gathered believers. 20 feet away, the men under the tree sat completely dry, watching with grim satisfaction as the program dissolved into chaos. Gabriel stood in the downpour, his clothes soaked, his Bible dripping, staring at the tree. And the tree, ancient and unmoved, seemed almost to shimmer with something that might have been laughter. Gabriel didn't leave. He rented a room from a widow at the edge of the village and began to fast. For 3 days, he ate nothing, drank only water, and prayed with an intensity that frightened the people who heard him through the thin walls. On the 4th day, he called a village meeting. The elders came because they had to. Baba Ade, the oldest living man in Umosi, presided from his carved stool, his face unreadable. The men came because they were curious. The women came because they were desperate for change. Gabriel stood before them, thinner, hollowed out, but burning with conviction. "I've been shown the truth," he said. That tree was planted by our ancestors as a meeting place between the living and the dead. They made sacrifices there. They honored the spirits there. They kept the covenant. But your fathers and their fathers stopped. They took the blessings, the shade, the gathering place, the spiritual protection, but they stopped giving honor. And when you dishonor a covenant, it doesn't just disappear. It inverts. The blessing becomes a curse. Nonsense, Chief Okonkwo spat. The tree is just a tree. You're looking for something to blame for your own failures. Am I? Gabriel's eyes swept the crowd. Then tell me why you can't stop drinking. Why you can't work. Why this village has produced nothing in 20 years except more poverty and more excuses. You think it's laziness. It's spiritual bondage. That tree is drinking your ambition, your strength, your future. And it will keep drinking until there's nothing left. The silence that followed was thick and ugly. Because everyone felt it, the truth of what he'd said, the accuracy of the diagnosis even if they hated the cure. Baba Ode finally spoke, his voice like dry leaves. What would you have us do? Gabriel met his eyes. Cut it down. The argument that followed nearly tore Umosi apart. The men, led by Chief Okonkwo, absolutely refused. The tree was their inheritance, their landmark, their meeting place. To cut it would be to erase the village's identity. They accused Gabriel of arrogance, of bringing city religion to destroy village tradition. You want to cut down what took centuries to grow because of a superstition. Okonkwo roared. This is madness. But the women saw it differently. Amora stood, her voice cutting through the chaos. What tradition? Sitting drunk under a tree while your wives and children starve. That's the tradition you're protecting. We've watched you waste away for years, and we're tired. If there's even a chance that tree is the reason, then I say cut it down. Other women rose to join her. Becky, who had been healed by the tree's water but had watched her brothers become shells of men in its shade. Mama Ngozi, whose husband had died under that tree, drunk and unmourned. Sister Patience, who had prayed for change for so long she'd almost given up on prayer. The men and women faced each other across the village square, the tree standing between them like a judgment waiting to be pronounced. Baba Ode raised his hand for silence. The old man's authority was absolute, even the angriest voices fell quiet. I remember, he said slowly, when my father told me about the old ways. About the sacrifices we no longer make, the prayers we no longer say. He told me we were living on borrowed blessings, and one day the death would come due. He looked at the tree, and something passed across his face, recognition or regret or both. Maybe that day has come. He turned to Gabriel. Cut it down. The men's protests were immediate and furious, but the elders' word was final. The tree's fate had been decided. The days that followed were tense and strange. The men continued to sit under the tree, but their laughter had turned bitter, their arguments tinged with genuine anger. Some of them organized a night watch, as if Gabriel might sneak out with an axe under cover of darkness. Others tried to appeal to Baba Ade, but the old man refused to see them. Gabriel, meanwhile, made preparations. He contacted a logging company in the nearest town, arranged for machinery and workers. He organized the women into a support team, providing water, food, prayers. He preached every evening about the new beginning that awaited Umosi once the spiritual blockage was removed. But late at night, alone in his rented room, doubt crept in. What if he was wrong? What if the tree was just a tree and the village's problems were simply the result of poverty, poor education, lack of opportunity? What if cutting it down changed nothing? He thought about the localized rain, the way it had fallen only on his gathering as if the tree itself was defending its territory. He thought about Becky's healing, the water that had appeared and disappeared without explanation. The tree was something. He just wasn't sure if it was blessing or curse or something older and stranger that defied such simple categories. On the morning the logging crew arrived, the entire village gathered. Some came to witness. Others came to protest. A few came to pray. Gabriel stood at the front, Bible in hand, trying to look certain. Behind him, the men from the logging company unloaded chainsaws and prepared their equipment. And above them all, the Acharu stood in perfect stillness, its leaves barely stirring in the breeze. The first worker approached with his axe raised, and the village held its breath. The blade beat into the bark with a sound like a scream. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tree began to bleed. Not sap. Not resin. Water. Crystal clear water that burst from the wound with such pressure it knocked the worker backward. The crowd gasped and scrambled away as the flow intensified, gushing from the cut in a torrent that should have been impossible. Within seconds, the ground around the tree's base was flooding, water spreading across the packed earth of the village square in widening pools. "Stop," someone shouted. "Stop cutting." But no one was cutting anymore. Everyone stood frozen, watching as the tree poured out what seemed like an ocean from a wound no bigger than a fist. The water caught the sunlight, throwing rainbows across the stunned faces of the villagers. And then they began to notice. Mama Ojo, who had been blind in one eye for 15 years, suddenly blinked and cried out she could see. Chief Okonkwo's arthritic hands, gnarled and useless for years, straightened before his eyes. A child with a persistent cough drew breath without wheezing. Another with a twisted foot stood tall. The realization rippled through the crowd like electricity. This wasn't just water. It was healing. People surged forward, shoving and shouting, desperate to drink, to touch, to bottle some of the miracle before it disappeared. The logging crew backed away, their machinery forgotten. Gabriel stood paralyzed, his certainty crumbling into dust. The tree he had condemned as a curse was saving his village with its own blood. For 20 minutes, the water flowed. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The wound sealed itself. The pools of water began to sink into the thirsty earth. And the village was left standing in mud and miracles, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Gabriel left 3 days later. He packed his bag, said goodbye to no one, and took the first bus back to the city. Some said he left in shame. Others said he left in fear. A few whispered that he'd seen something in the tree's final act, a message or a warning, that had broken something in him. The tree remained standing. The axe wound had healed over completely, leaving only a faint scar in the bark. The logging company refused to return, no matter how much money was offered. "That tree doesn't want to die," the foreman said. "And I'm not dying to prove otherwise." The village slowly returned to normal, but normal had shifted. The healing water had cured bodies but complicated souls. The men still gathered under the tree, but quietly now, respectfully. They cleaned the area around it, cleared the trash, stopped using it as a urinal when they were drunk. The women still worked hard, but some of the bitterness had eased. The tree had bled for them. Whatever it wasn't their enemy. Baba Ode died 2 months later, peaceful in his sleep. At his funeral, someone asked if he'd known what would happen when the tree was cut. The old man had left no answer, only a cryptic statement recorded by his daughter: some questions aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be lived with. Years passed. Children grew up hearing the story of the bleeding tree, though each generation told it differently. Some said Gabriel had been a prophet. Others said he'd been a fool. Some said the tree was a god. Others said it was a prison for something older than gods. The tree itself offered no explanations. It stood in the center of Umosi, casting its shade, sheltering its people, keeping its secrets. And the village learned to live in the space between blessing and curse, between faith and fear, between the desire to understand and the wisdom to simply be grateful. Because sometimes, the greatest mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They are meant to teach us humility, to remind us that we don't control everything, that some gifts come with questions attached, and accepting the gift means accepting the questions too. The Acharu stands still. Umosi endures. And somewhere between the roots and the sky, the truth waits, patient, ancient, and utterly beyond human judgment.